Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we attend the Republican National Convention in Cleveland and talk to several Illinois politicians in attendance, including U.S. Representative Rodney Davis and State Representatives Adam Brown and Ed Sullivan, among others. We'll also talk to Michael Barone, the senior political analyst for the WashingtonExaminer.com. And finally, in about 30 minutes from now, we attend a presentation by Mark Depew, Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, titled Deadlock in the Trenches, The Warfare of World War I. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our Advisory Council members.
The Illinois Channel salutes our Advisory Council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Phil Garnett, President of the Illinois Coal Association. Illinois is blessed with an abundance of coal. In fact, coal lies under 65% of Illinois land, and coal is used to provide half of the nation's energy needs, abundant and domestic. With energy independence at the top of our national agenda, Illinois coal mines, like the one here in Williamsville, must be part of our national discussion on energy. That's why the Illinois Coal Association supports the work of the Illinois Channel. Their extensive coverage of the role Illinois coal plays in meeting America's energy needs is a valuable contribution to informed discussion on a serious issue, such as the Illinois Channel's coverage of the FutureGen project, which holds a promise of environmentally friendly use of coal, or the Illinois Channel's unedited, in-depth interview with Fred Palmer of Peabody Energy. Serious coverage of serious issues. That's the Illinois Channel. You keep up the good work, and we'll keep watching.
Next, we attend the Republican National Convention in Cleveland and talk to several Illinois politicians in attendance, including U.S. Representative Rodney Davis and State Representatives Adam Brown and Ed Sullivan, among others. We'll also talk to Michael Barone, the senior political analyst for the WashingtonExaminer.com. This runs about 30 minutes.
Representative Adam Brown, thanks for joining us. And here we are at the National Convention in Cleveland. How you been spending this is only the first day, but give us your overview of what you think the nomination of Donald Trump means for the Republican Party nationally from your perspective and within the state of Illinois.
Well, I'm excited personally. I think Mr. Trump brings into the fold a lot of folks who haven't conventionally described themselves as Republicans. And so if you take a look at the electorate, you see more votes for Mr. Trump than you do any Republican presidential candidate to this point. And so it's obviously driving out voter enrollment and voter activation, and I think it's important that we get folks involved and try to understand why they want to be involved in this process. And I think a lot of that trends back to his perspective that an outsider needs to take the reins of the presidency, that we need to have an injection of folks with free thought, folks that want to focus on the simplicity of government, which is hands-off governance, which I as a farmer strongly abide to. And I think it's a very energetic time for the Republican Party, and I'm glad to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about state politics. Now, you finally, that is the legislature finally got some spending bill. I wouldn't even call it a budget, the way it is funded for 6 months, with the exception of education. And you have decided you're not seeking re-election. Tell the viewers, why are you not seeking re-election to the State House?
Sure. So my father and I are partners in our farming operation. It's a 6th-generation operation. We farm corn and soybeans. And my grandpa, he's 95 years old and still comes out there with the bean hook and tries to be as active as possible. And I think that's an incredible opportunity for me that I can't possibly pass up. To have my grandfather involved, to have my 2 young kids. I've got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. It's a great time to be home with the family and focus on what's most important in our lives, and that's, of course, being with one another and seeing our kids grow. Of course, my 6 years in government, it's been a huge honor, and I applaud my colleagues and leader Jim Durkin. He's given me some very special opportunities to be in his leadership. And so I really do appreciate that as well.
What are your thoughts? I mean, you've served under both Governor Quinn and now Governor Rauner as far as the direction that the state is moving or not moving. Just give us, having had this experience, are we getting back on the right track, or do you expect that we're just going to be spinning our wheels for a couple of years?
You know, I came into a House 6 years ago with supermajorities both in the House and in the Senate for the Democrats, and that's very difficult. And until we had a governor in place that could provide checks and balances for the system, you know, it was a free-for-all. And we were essentially printing money in the state of Illinois and handing it out to everybody we met. Fortunately, that's changed under Governor Rauner, and I believe going forward that finally we're going to see Speaker Madigan transition out of his post, and that's going to give us tremendous opportunities to get a balanced budget that's reasonable for the constituents of Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, you being a farmer, there's other people that might pick up and leave the state and go somewhere else, so you're not going to be doing that. Your business is literally the land, so your future is here with the people. And do you ever see yourself running again for any office, or do you think farming is going to be your total future?
You know, I'm stuck in Illinois for the long haul, and I'm honored to be so.
No, stuck is the right one. But you're going to be living in Illinois, right?
But I'm going to definitely stay involved in the process in some manner or fashion. I definitely enjoy the campaign side and working with my colleagues in the Illinois House. So I'm going to promote them as much as possible.
All right. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and good luck to you in the future.
Great to see you. Appreciate it.
Congressman Rodney Davis, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And here we are at Cleveland, Ohio, the Republican National Convention 2016. What are your thoughts as you come here tonight on the verge of seeing Donald Trump become the Republican nominee?
You know, my first thought was, oh my gosh, that's Terry Martin standing right inside the door, and get a chance to talk to you. It's great to see familiar faces. You know, my thoughts are the country right now is reeling over the police officers that were shot in Baton Rouge, and national security is a major concern. And I think that's what Mike Pence and Donald Trump bring to this race. Hopefully it's a serious discussion on how we protect American families, and that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, Mike Pence just announced the other day, and here he is, a Midwest governor right next door to us in Indiana. Were you surprised by that selection? Did you have someone else in mind that you would have liked to have seen?
No, I'm not surprised. Frankly, I'm thankful. I mean, Mike Pence is somebody that I've gotten to meet a couple of times. I don't know him well, but he's somebody who served in Washington, was a member of Congress like I am during September 11th. You know, he's seen the Patriot Act in its infancy. He's seen this fight against terrorism in its infancy. And I think he's somebody who could sit around the table and have a grown-up discussion on how we actually put laws in place to fight terrorist activity. And I think that's good for Donald Trump's campaign.
What about Donald Trump? Was he your selection, or did you have someone else in mind? When we had 17 candidates, probably the majority of Republicans had someone else in mind with 17 candidates. Who did you start off supporting?
You know, I ended up endorsing Marco Rubio, and I was a big Marco fan. I thought he would have made a great president, and I still do. I'm glad he's running for Senate again. My person didn't win, though. And frankly, coming from Christian County, an area that used to be a Democrat stronghold, now is a Republican stronghold, I have lifelong Democrats coming up to me telling me they are not going to vote for Hillary Clinton for president. They don't trust her, and they don't think she tells the truth.
Well, and the other thing, I think your district would take in, does it take in some of the coal areas of southern Illinois? It seems to be, if I understand it right, in West Virginia, that may be a state that goes for Trump because of the coal issue and people perceiving her. What is that what you're hearing, and what issues are resonating among the populace in your district?
I Hear that, Terry, and it is resonating, the fact that Hillary Clinton said maybe coal miners need to lose their jobs. You know, part of the reason I'm in Washington is because too many coal miners in my district years ago lost their job because of the Clean Air Act amendments of the early 90s. And now this administration, the Obama administration, wants to actually stop the use of coal, stop burning coal at our electrical utility plants. And what that means for every single family in my district, it means higher utility prices just to turn the lights on. It's wrong, it's short-sighted, and America does not get enough credit for the emissions reductions that we've done over the last 20 to 25 years. And that's where I want to stand up and fight Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's, their path, their march to a path of destruction for the coal-fired utility industries in this country, which right now, in my district, Terry, some of the best paying jobs I have. You're talking Coffeen Power Plant, Kincaid Power Plant, Springfield, even the nuclear plant in Exelon, or in Clinton, the Exelon plant. These are the things we have to protect, because it's about protecting our local economy and protecting jobs and protecting lower prices for every single family every time they turn the light switch on.
When you're going to be running for re-election, or are running for re-election, and how do you think having a Donald Trump at the top of the ticket plays in your district?
Well, I run my own race, and I think most of the races in Illinois, down ballot, the presidential race isn't going to have any effect. I mean, if the presidential race had an effect on me, I would have lost in 2012. We won by a larger margin than Mitt Romney did, and, you know, coattails are coattails, whether or not they're reality. I just haven't figured that out yet.
Congressman Rodney Davis, we appreciate you talking to us.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. Senator Chipman Rose, thanks for joining us. What do you, as we are here at the convention, what are your thoughts on this team going into the fall for the Republicans in Illinois?
Yeah, this has been, I think, a good convention, maybe a little bit unconventional and unique, but that's great. A lot of new people. You know, I think that the pick of Mike Pence does a lot to unify the party. But then when you talk about reaching out, and conventions have two themes, unification and reaching out. If you watch the traditional roll call of states last night, usually that's led by high-ranking officials of the party. Last night was real people in a lot of cases. People that just said, hey, you know what, we're going the wrong direction in this country. We need to turn it around. And they got involved. They got engaged. So I think it's having the effect of unifying the grassroots, but at the same time, we're starting to reach out, and this jobs is it. There was a poll out this week, 70% of America thinks we're going the wrong direction. Okay, wrong direction. There's not opportunity for the kids. People feel less secure. And that's what we're talking about here, how we provide jobs and opportunity for our children and grandchildren, and how we secure our country to make sure people can live in safety, raise a family, and enjoy the greatest country that ever, enjoy the greatest country on earth.
It gets a little noisy, but let me ask you just one. Have you been working your district as yet? And do you get feedback from people on Donald Trump being the nominee of the Republican Party?
Yeah, so in the 15th Congressional District that I was elected, actually as a Cruz delegate, Donald Trump won the district overwhelmingly. So I'm a bit of an anomaly, having been elected for someone else to come here. But look, the fact is, people get it. In Decatur, Illinois, we need jobs. We desperately need jobs. Last night, I thought one of the most poignant moments in the roll call of states was the West Virginia delegation that called out Hillary Clinton and said, Hillary, you told us you want us out of work. You want to put all of us out of work. You want to kill coal. Well, guess what? They may kill coal in West Virginia, but in Decatur, Illinois, is the Caterpillar manufacturing plant that makes all those heavy mining trucks that are used in coal. So it doesn't just impact West Virginia, it impacts my district in Illinois. This is about jobs, it's about the future, it's about prosperity and opportunity. And if you listen to these speakers right now, right behind us, first female commander on a Soyuz space shuttle mission ever, okay? She had the opportunity to do that. We have to have the same opportunities for our children, and that's where our party's going to lead. And I'll tell you what, if anybody thinks there's an enthusiasm issue with us, they got it wrong. If you heard this place rocking when Laura Ingraham was out there, you could hear, I mean, you could feel it. On the other hand, you got Hillary, and everyone's like, well, it's her turn. It's Hillary's turn. That's not a reason to vote for anybody.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Representative Ed Sullivan, here at the Republican Convention at Cleveland, we saw earlier in the week there was a little bit of split among the Republican delegates who had backed other candidates. You had backed John Kasich earlier on. Where is the Illinois delegation right now, and just the Republican Party thinking coming together? behind Donald Trump?
Well, you know, there's 16 candidates that ran for president. There's obviously going to be some acrimony as the campaign ends down. Well, we now have a nominee in Donald Trump. His role as the leader of the Republican Party now that he's been elected is to unify people. And so there's those of us, like myself, who was a Kasich delegate, that are looking for a reason to follow Donald Trump. I don't need a reason to dislike Hillary Clinton. I already know that. I need a reason why Donald Trump should be my guy. And so I'm here. I'm open minds. I'm hoping for unity. There was a little hiccup earlier in the week, and we'll see how that all plays out. But we need Mr. Trump to reach out to those that weren't with him, that weren't part of his Trump Express, if you will, because he's going to need us to win the election in November. But it can't be about, well, vote for me because Hillary Clinton is worse. We need, why should we vote for you? And so we're looking for that, and that's why I'm here. That's why I have an open mind. I haven't closed the door to Donald Trump. I'm not part of the no Trump people or the whatever. And so that's what we're working on right now, and we're enjoying it right now.
What do you think of the selection of Governor Pence? Does that, you think, assuage some of the fears of some of the people who thought maybe Donald Trump was too much of a loose cannon, that he has someone who's more viewed as more stable and a solid guy with the government experience?
Well, what Pence brings to the ticket is a very solid reformer when it comes to how to grow your business, how to do good things for your state, what we're trying to do in Illinois. So I've really enjoyed that pick from that standpoint. I'm not in favor of Pence for a lot of some other views that he has, but what he will do is he will bring the social conservative party, the wing of the party that maybe isn't quite sold on Donald Trump. And so by bringing him in, I think that helps unify the party, quite frankly. I personally would have liked a Gingrich pick from the stability that Gingrich brings, the knowledge base that he has. But Pence is a wonderful pick. So your A or B pick, whichever you want to put it, they both bring different pieces to the puzzle to bring Trump to the presidency. And so that's, I can't say that I dislike the pick of Pence at all. I might have had another one, but he will help unify a certain faction of the party behind Trump.
Thanks. Sure. Representative David Harris, here we are at the convention, and hopefully we'll hear each other over the speech being given behind us. What are your thoughts as you're here just on the condition of the Republican Party and as we go into the fall election with this Donald Trump and Governor Pence as a team?
I think it's going to be a strong team. I think the Republicans can win in November. There's been some ups and downs leading to this point. Those are going to be smoothed out, and I think the party's going to be basically united going into the fall. You've got a fired up base, and we're ready to win in November.
Do you know anything about Governor Pence? Have you met him before, and what are your thoughts on his selection?
I crossed paths with Governor Pence once just to shake his hand at an official ceremony, so I don't know a whole heck of a lot about him. But I think from what I've read, he's an excellent choice. Solid Midwestern, has the type of values that appeal to the average American. He'll do great.
And just in general conversations you've had with fellow delegates, are they coming together now as supporting Trump, despite whatever differences they might have had?
You know, the convention, I think, has come together. I think the way they handled the convention, they let every delegation vote as the vote was handled in its respective state. As an example, in Illinois, overwhelmingly for Trump, but the Cruz and the Kasich delegates got the vote as well. So it was an open convention. They're bringing everybody together. I think they're doing a great job with what they've done here in Cleveland.
Great. Thank you for joining.
Good to talk to you.
Representative John Cabello, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We're here at in Cleveland at the Republican National Convention on the first day. What are your thoughts as we are here on the verge of, as we tape this, of nominating Donald Trump?
Well, it's exciting. This is my first time here. I've never been a delegate before, and I've never come to a convention before. So this is really kind of neat to see how everything works. Obviously, I was elected to the Rules Committee, so I went through that process last week. We had a meeting today to reaffirm what we did last week. There's a small minority that was trying to add some things in there that we just didn't want. Unbinding of delegates and having a conscience vote. We successfully defeated that. I believe there was maybe 12 people that actually wanted it out of 112. We just got done with a floor vote as well on those rules. Obviously, people saw some displeasure by the small minority, but we got it passed, and we are on the way of nominating Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States.
I mean, as everyone who's followed this election, they often say about how unusual this is. And of course, I mean, even Donald Trump never held office before. I don't remember in my lifetime ever nominating someone who's never had any government experience. Eisenhower, was a general. 17 candidates. Were you for Donald Trump from the beginning or another candidate from the beginning?
I was actually a Jeb Bush guy. Tom Cross had asked me to join his camp, so I lent my name. And when he dropped out, talking with Newt Gingrich, he's the one that had me start looking at Donald Trump. And that's
Newt Gingrich? Or?
Newt Gingrich, yeah.
And how were you in communication with him?
Sitting next to him at lunch in Washington at a convention.
And what did he say that got you to think about Donald Trump?
Just that he's going to win. I mean, Newt was saying that, Donald's got a message that hasn't been heard in a very long time. He's anti-establishment. He stands for almost everything that I do, and he really wanted me to take a look, and so I did. It was end of February, and we were the first one to come out and support Donald Trump, at least in the state. Now I'm the co-chair of the Trump for President campaign in Illinois.
For those who don't know your background, so you spent 20 years as a police officer in the Rockford area, if I have that right?
Yes, sir. I'm on a leave of absence, looking forward to going back in November.
So two things. Donald Trump said I'm the law and order candidate, and obviously, unfortunately, we taped this just in the last 2 weeks. We've had the officers in Dallas, and then yesterday, as we taped this, the officers in New Orleans. What are your thoughts? I mean, you could do a whole program on this, but in general, how does the Donald Trump candidacy fit into what we are experiencing domestically, about the threat internationally? And internationally, you don't have the experience perhaps, but you certainly do as a police officer domestically. Let's take that aspect. How does his message resonate with citizens, and from the perspective of you having served on the streets? What would you tell your fellow citizens as far as why you support Trump in that regard?
Well, Donald Trump was one of the first candidates to start publicly supporting our policemen, our law enforcement officers. From the time about 6 months ago, he really started hammering home that he supports our law enforcement and he supports making our military strong again compared to what it's been in the Barack Obama administration, breaking it down, taking people out of our military and shrinking it. I firmly believe that Donald Trump will grow our military again, because I do believe that strong military will equal peace without having to use it that often. And I think when we have a commander-in-chief and a president who is supporting our law enforcement, instead of coming out saying that law enforcement is wrong, law enforcement did wrong, we all know that there are good people in law enforcement, and we know, unfortunately, there may be some bad, just like every profession. We are correcting the ways we do things, but I think it's going to be great to have somebody in the executive branch come out and keep supporting our law enforcement.
Another interesting thing that you had said when you spoke for Donald Trump at the state convention, you referred to yourself as an American of Hispanic descent,
yes.
Not as an Hispanic American. Why do you distinguish that? I mean, do you think it's wrong that when people use the hyphenated American phraseology?
No, I mean, everybody has the right to do what they wish. Everybody has the right to say it any way that they want. I'm an American before anything else. I would hope that anyone else that lives in this country that has some form of ethnicity with that they would want to be an American before anything else.
And as you said, this is your first convention ever. What have you seen? What are your thoughts? What surprised you? I mean, just for most of the people watching this had never been to a convention, so as a first timer, what do you think?
It's pretty neat. I like the fact that Donald Trump is bringing in people that have been so far out of the political realm for so long because of how fed up they are with it. It's nice to see those people coming back. When we were in a breakfast, we asked, how many people are here for the first time? More than half of the hands went up saying that they were here for the first time ever. That's a good thing. When you get more people involved that haven't been involved, that's a good thing because you get different ideas, you get to hear different perspectives. How could you go wrong with that?
Well said, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Michael Barone, longtime political analyst and now with the Washington Examiner. We appreciate you joining us. A lot of people have said that this is one of the strangest elections they've ever seen, and here we see Donald Trump on The Apprentice all these years, now on the verge of becoming the Republican presidential nominee. What are your thoughts?
Well, anybody who coming from Illinois who calls another political situation strange may have to look in the mirror once in a while on that basis. But look, we have the two most unpopular presumptive nominees, as I stand here, for the two major political parties in the history of political conventions. It goes back to 1832 on the Democratic side, 1856 on the Republican side. 19th century may have had some more unpopular ones, but we didn't have public opinion polling until 1935, so we don't have numbers on those folks. But yes, it's interesting. In both parties, the more downscale voters are the ones that gave the big margins, that put the nominees over the top, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And as much as I think we Americans just basically sympathize with underdogs and people who start off in life with disadvantages, but they have given us they've given each party a candidate that has significant vulnerabilities.
You obviously, Illinois is a blue state, and it will remain a blue state as far as the presidential candidate. I'd be shocked if that's not the case. But as you look at the landscape across the entire country here, how would you call the race as far as you see it today?
Well, I call the race kind of unsettled. I mean, we are used to a political situation where we have very strong partisan loyalties on the part of the large majority of the electorates, relatively few uncommitted in election after election, and they're closely divided, so it's easy to predict how 38 or 40 states will vote, and it's hard to predict who will actually win. And in that environment, only 3 states changed party between 2000 and 2004, only 2 between 2008 and 2012. This election looks different. We're looking at a significant number of voters who tell current pollsters they're not voting for either one of the major party nominees, and that number grows to more than 20% if you include the names of third and fourth party candidates.
I was going to say, we often have these polls bantied about in the media. I am of the opinion that so many of these polls are almost like, maybe not worthless, but not something I would put a lot of significance on until we get maybe to September, because so many people are late to the game as far as deciding really what they're going to do. And then we have this horrible environment to where we have a terrorist attack happening every so often, and now these police officers being shot. To what extent do you think those sort of events external to any campaign are going to have an impact on the electorate's mindset?
Well, events, can have a deep imprint on the public mind. And what we're seeing around the world and in the United States, a certain amount of disorder, disarray. We're seeing the Middle East in all sorts of turmoil, refugees coming across the Mediterranean or people posing as refugees. We're seeing murders of mass numbers of policemen in major cities. That's pretty alarming. And I think as a general rule, disarray and disorder work against the party, the incumbents in power, and gets people thinking about selecting an alternative in a democratic election. And, the question is, are they willing to select Donald Trump, who, doesn't have experience in public office, who has, in the opinion of many voters, other problems, even though he's got his strong supporters. So it makes it a lot harder to predict than these elections where we've had pretty much everybody falling along party lines. Now we seem to have something different.
I could talk to you for an hour, and I know I won't hold you up too long, but the last question. Trump seems to have surprised a lot of people. He surprised me, and I think people just didn't take him seriously at first. Did he surprise you, and is his campaign an aberration, or is it maybe something that's more, would you guess, something that is the way campaigns might be going in the future with the changing landscape of media and what you need to break through all the cacophony of different outlets?
Well, yes, Donald Trump's success in this has come as a surprise to me. If you'd seen me 14 months ago, I wasn't predicting this. I know very few people who were. Many of them are on the Trump payroll. So, you know, it is a surprise. I hesitate to make general rules out of it. We've only had 47 presidential elections since the two-party system came into effect in 1828 or 1832. We've only had 11 races for party nominations in which primaries have been the way of selecting most delegates. So it's, you know, I used to be in the public polling business with the Democratic pollster Peter Hart, and one of the things is he said when you have less than 50 people in a subgroup, I don't want to even see those numbers because the error margin is so large and the number of cases is so low that I don't really want to make generalizations. Political scientists are paid to make such generalizations. They like to claim there's a science, there are laws that determine outcome. I think Donald Trump's success in this endeavor is going to be indicative of all other future races in which we have 17 serious candidates for nomination of a political party, and one of them is a reality TV star.
You're one of the great political insiders people should listen to if they want to read more about your writings. Where can they find you?
Take a look at WashingtonExaminer.com, and also I'm a resident fellow at the think tank American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it, sir.
Next, from Springfield, we attend a presentation by Mark Depew, Director of Oral History at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, titled Deadlock in the Trenches, The Warfare of World War I. This runs about 1 hour and 30 minutes.
Thank you, Alan. It is very much appreciative that you have all come out tonight. It's probably a little bit too hot to be outside today, but I can guarantee even if you were outside, you'd be a whole lot less miserable than the soldiers we're going to be talking about today. Trench warfare has been a kind of a perverse fascination to mine for quite a long time. World War I in general has, and most people who are interested in World War I, that's not necessarily the subject that draws them in. But it has always been a fascination of mine, in part, just like it was for the Civil War. It's impossible for me to understand how the soldiers did what they did over these long periods of time. And what I hope to be able to accomplish today is give you a sense of exactly why they got bogged down in the trench warfare like they did, and what it was like for the average soldier, and the challenges for the generals trying to figure out how to break out of those trenches. I probably have mentioned this in previous presentations, the one I did a couple years ago. I think the First World War is the most important historical event of the last 200 years, since the French Revolution. Most people would think that doesn't make a lot of sense, that it should be World War II or something else. But in my mind, World War II is an extension of World War I. And the revolutions that occurred afterwards, the breakup of several empires after the First World War, the redesigning of the world because of the Treaty of Versailles, explain why I feel that way. In fact, you know, what's been the headline news for the last few years? Things that have been happening in the Middle East. When were those country boundaries drawn? At the end of the First World War. But tonight, it's a little bit different. We're going to be talking about that in a later presentation. But tonight, it's to get a sense of why it was so traumatic for Europe, for France and England and Germany in particular, to have this incredible level of violence and destruction and loss of life like you saw in the First World War. So, very quickly, you probably have seen this slide before if you've been to other ones. This is not exactly the Schlieffen Plan, but it gives you a good idea of what the Germans were trying to accomplish in the initial phase in 1914. The sweeping attack It was supposed to envelop Paris and crush the French army. But first, of course, you had to go through Belgium. And once you go through Belgium, you have violated Belgian neutrality, and that's what brings the British into the war. So August 2nd, the Germans invade. By August 4th, you have the United Kingdom declaring war. By September 5th, you have the Battle of the Marne beginning to take shape, where the French are finally recouping their losses and regaining themselves and hunkering down for a long fight with the Germans. And that's what they were able to do. September 5th through September 12th, you have the Battle of the Marne. And then after the Battle of the Marne, this is a very, very quick overview for 1914, what you have is the race to the sea. Now, up to this point in 1914, in the fall, what you have is a series of maneuvers on a massive scale with the enemy, the two sides, always trying to outmaneuver each other and get that particular advantage so that you could attack in the flanks or overwhelm them. Now what you have a solid line and then a series of envelopments all trying to get around the flank of the enemy. So first the French would try to get around the flanks of the Germans, and they would be able to extend the line. The Germans would try to do the same thing. The French would extend the line, and they kept trying to do that until they got to the North Sea. And at that point in time, you have a solid line of trenches. And the challenge from here on out is for the generals to figure out a way to bust through the trenches, to get into open terrain, because they believed in the value of mobility and maneuver. And you could only win a decisive battle if you could do that. Punch through the lines, get behind, and envelop, make the enemy respond to what you're doing. So we're going to see from 1914 all the way to 1918 this continual struggle trying to figure out how to break out of these trenches. Once that happens and you get to the sea, the obvious reaction then for the soldiers is to dig in. The Germans were really the first ones to dig in. So here's the Germans up on top here. They had the advantage since they had occupied almost all of Belgium and a significant part of France, to include much of its industrial and mining capacity. They chose the best ground, high ground, dry ground in most cases. They could back up until they found that. And they were serious about digging in. Their trenches, especially initially, were much better constructed. Whatever the engineering prowess of the Germans that we normally think of. But I think more importantly, they planned to stay there. They were not going to go back on the offensive for a little while. They knew they were going to have to defend themselves. On the other side, you've got the French and the Brits who are also going to be digging in. Their mentality is quite different, especially the French. Their mentality was, we need to push the Germans, the dreaded Huns, out of the sacred soil of France. They know they're going to have to go on the offensive to do that. So they don't dig quite as elaborate trench systems. All of this is happening in 1914. 1915, you see the armies moving back and forth. Primarily the Germans were on the Eastern Front, going after the Russians in that year. But both the French and the British tried offensives. The French on a larger scale because the Brits didn't have much of an army. We'll get into that in just a second. It became obvious by the end of 1915 that for whatever reason, the defense had the great advantage. And here's a quote that I wanted to share with you here before we go too much farther. The comment that was made by one author in trying to understand why it was that we got to this stage when this incredible era of enthusiasm and excitement and innovation had occurred before World War I had happened now that we got bogged down in this war. His comment, Max Brooks's comment, the children of the Renaissance in the age of reason and in the Enlightenment ended up massacring themselves in the mud and the blood of the trenches. So in part, it's our job tonight to try to understand that. The thing I want to keep keep in mind for all of us here as we go forward in trying to understand why the defense was supreme during this war is to try to understand what had happened in the 40 or 50 years before that. If we think in our generation, we're all convinced that we have seen this technological innovation and advance like no other generation in the world had ever seen, we would be wrong. Because the generation that was born perhaps in the 1860s and came of age and were still alive during the First World War, and certainly the soldiers that fought it, they had seen incredible changes. And just to give you a sense of that, we all know that by the Civil War, railroads had made a huge impact on the nature of warfare, and the telegraph had made a huge impact as well. This is the dawn of the industrial age, where we're seeing it come to fruition. What happens after the Civil War? Here's just a few. 1876, the invention of the telephone. That will factor in a big way in trench warfare. Later 1870s, you've got the impact of electricity. And really the innovation that launches it all is the light bulb. Edison is kind of taking advantage of a lot of other inventions, but 1879 he finally comes up with the right filament so the light bulb can last for a long enough time. And think of the impact just of electricity on our lives today and how that changed everything in the world. Here's another one that we sometimes overlook: the growth of the chemical industry, and especially in terms of explosive power. Dynamite's invented in 1866. Smokeless powder. Sounds like a little thing. It's very big for the First World War. 1884. If you recall, in the Civil War era, after you fire a few volleys of artillery, and especially your rifled muskets, it's hard to see what's going on in the battlefield. That's much less an issue now. Cordite, another explosive, 1889. Vaccines are starting to become more prevalent. So in the First World War, we're saying this is the first war where combat casualties exceed deaths from disease and illnesses. So that's significant as well. Motor vehicles really got a launch in 1886 when Carl Benz figured out how to develop a vehicle that he could produce at a decent scale and then start to sell. Think of the impact that just motor vehicles is going to have on our society today. But even at that time, photography had been developing over the 19th century. By 1895, it's not just photography. You saw so much more of it in the First World War and capturing so much more of the movement, but you also have motion pictures by that time. And it's a relatively mature industry by the time you get to the beginning of the First World War. Radio, 1902. Another huge innovation. Although there's a cautionary tale on radio because it really doesn't impact what goes on in the battlefield until you get to the Second World War. And finally, the one that we always think about, 1903, and the Wright brothers and the first flight. And that's certainly going to change how warfare is as well. But we still haven't touched on what it is that's getting the battlefield to be so much bloodier and so much more dangerous. And it starts with the evolution of the rifle. The musket, what we had for centuries, and still a significant percentage of Confederate soldiers especially, and some Union soldiers in the Civil War, had muskets. But as we know, most Civil War soldiers had rifled muskets. So it took the max range from 200. Just having that rifling in the tube, you can get a much greater muzzle velocity and much better stability of the round going out. So it takes it from 200 to 1,000 yards. And for most of us, it's tough to see past 1,000 yards. Try to do that. The problem, and here's the big change for the Civil War, from 1 round a minute for a musket, because you had to cram that thing down, to 3 rounds per minute. That's a huge increase. But now there's another revolutionary step that's being taken. You've got breech loaders. Instead of putting the round down the muzzle, you're loading it through the breech, and you have smokeless powder. And look at the difference in ranges we have. The German 1898 Mauser, 2,200, way beyond what you can typically see. An effective range, not 200, but 550 yards. Now, if you can see the enemy that far out, moving across no man's land, you can engage them. And if you're a good shot, you can probably take them out. The French model was Lebel and a Lee Enfield for the Brits. These numbers over here, the rate of fire, a very subjective number when I started doing research because it involved a couple things. Did you take time to aim? If you take time to aim, it's a different story. There's a second or two at least that you've got to do to work that through. And you have to change your magazine. So a 5-round magazine is what the Germans had. The Lebel had an 8-round magazine tube that was rather awkward. They came out with a Berthier rifle a little bit later, but it was only 3 rounds. And that's a disadvantage over a 5-round because you got to fumble and change all of this. And then the Lee Enfield. Now, I've seen as much as for the Lebel that it could fire 34 rounds a minute. I don't know how you could do that, changing this thing out every once in a while, and at least making some rough attempt at aiming. So, still, look at the difference between what you had in the Civil War and here. The lethality of the battlefield has increased exponentially. And those serried ranks of Civil War soldiers that they saw in 1861, marching across in close ranks, well, that's a thing of the past. Now the best thing to do is to spread out a little bit and move much more quickly across the battlefield. Still, there are other things that factor into this as well. The machine gun. That's the thing that usually comes to mind for people about the First World War, the impact of the machine gun. The Gatling gun was something that was being experimentally used at the very tail end of the Civil War, never really made an impact on battle. But Sir Hiram Maxim, here's an interesting personality. He's an American who actually moves to England when he's 41 years old. He is credited as being the inventor of the first effective water-cooled machine gun in 1884. It's 60 pounds, so it's not light. It's belt-fed, 7.92 millimeter caliber weapon. That should sound familiar. We still use that kind of caliber in much of our weaponry today. Water-cooled, 500 rounds permitted, as long as your crew can keep feeding those belts into the machine gun. And a well-trained crew then can sweep the battlefield back and forth to the point where you can't hide from this. You've got to start digging or hunker down. Maximum range, effective range of 3,800 yards, so even farther out. And it developed a couple interesting nicknames that really is illustrative of the impact of the machine gun. The English called it the lawnmower. Now think about that, the lawnmower. Excuse me, that was the French term. The English called it the devil's paintbrush. Now, every country, by the time you get to the First World War, had some variation of the machine gun. This is the German. It's very close to what the Maxim original design was. The Vickers machine gun for the Brits was very close to the Maxim design to begin with. You also have the French Hotchkiss, and you've got the British Lewis machine gun. Now notice one difference here between the Lewis gun, smaller caliber, air-cooled, and the German Maxim gun. It's much smaller, it's much lighter, and therefore it's going to be much easier to move into no man's land with this and to move forward with the advancing infantry. That's going to be increasingly important as you go down the road. So, here's the real killer of World War I, and we sometimes lose track of this. Now, you'll have to forgive me, my early profession as a field artillery officer might show through on this. Improvements in artillery. It's staggering to think of the impact of this one. Artillery kills something like 60% of the casualties in the First World War. Rifled artillery, much like rifled firearms, it's going to have a big impact on the range and the muzzle velocity. You have breech loading. Instead of having to load through the barrel, you're loading through the breech. You have encased ammunition. Instead of putting a ball in and then a piece of powder behind that as a separate action, you can have it all in one encased. The bullet, the primer, the propellant is all in one encasement. And that's going to load much more quickly. You also have time fuses. It's a little bit early in the development of it. There's going to be a huge problem for the Brits later on. But this is something that is certainly achievable by the time. And what you want to do is to have an airburst so that shrapnel flies and kills the enemy as they're moving across open fields. Smokeless powder. And here's the big one. The last two are really the big ones. Recoil system. You think about, if you're watching an old Civil War movie and they're halfway accurate, you see the artillery round go off, and there goes the cannon backwards. And then they have to haul it back up again to put it into battery, put it back into position. And how accurate is it going to be the next time? Is the round going to land anywhere close to it was the first time? That's the challenge. The French were the first ones to really develop this with the 75 millimeter gun that they've got right up here. And you've got this pneumatic brake recoil system. So a mixture of oil and air, and the round is loaded, the round is fired, and that causes the recoil to occur. But because of the pneumatic system, it comes right back into battery again, almost immediately. This took an awful lot of time and development. This took a lot of different people working on that kind of a concept. But it was absolutely revolutionary after they achieved it. In fact, if you know anything about the Dreyfus affair, which roiled French politics for a decade or more, the core of that whole incident was the possibility that the Germans were getting this secret about the recoil system, some of the pieces of the recoil system. That's how important the French thought this was. Now, a good crew could fire this weapon. 6,500 meters was the range, approximately 4+ miles in range, much farther than a typical Civil War cannon could fire at the time. Half the range if it was a time fuse, but that's not a problem. You're going to land those in no man's land typically. But here's the interesting part. The max rate of fire was determined to be 30 rounds per minute. In other words, you pull the lanyard, the round goes out, it immediately comes back into battery, you open the breech, you slam in another round, and just that quick. And if you have a trained crew, you can really put down a lot of firepower very quickly. That's part one of this new incredible revolution in artillery. Part two is the indirect fire. Because now with the range that you had in these weapons, and some larger caliber weapons had a greater range, you're not right on the front lines. You're a mile or so behind the front lines. You can't see where your rounds are landing. So you have to have somebody, a forward observer, some way of figuring out where the round has landed. And then you've got to pass that information back to the firing battery and let them know, adjust to left, go out farther in range. In artillery lingo, that's quadrant and deflection. Quadrant for range, deflection for moving it left and right. And it gets to be a very scientific way that you're passing that information back. If you're in a fixed position, you've got telephone wires that are hooking the front line positions with you. But again, how far can you see from the front lines? Maybe a kilometer. Maybe it's tough to even see that far, what's going on. So we're going to find out a little bit more about that in the future. One of the authors I read about the improvements in artillery made this comment. Firepower, artillery firepower, had increased exponentially in range, accuracy, and lethality. But battlefield communications had not improved since Julius Caesar invaded Gaul. It's a little bit of a stretch. You had the telephone, but that's not going to work once you advance into no man's land. And again, more on that a little bit later. So, what are the soldiers to do now that they've got these much improved rifles? They've got machine guns sweeping no man's land. They've got artillery that's bombarding into no man's land. They dig in. And here's a little quiz for the audience here. What do you suppose these German soldiers are looking for? Yeah, ticks, but especially lice. The soldier's constant companion in the trenches. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I want to paint a picture, if you will, for what life is like for these soldiers. And in many cases, they're living here for days or weeks on end in the trenches. Maybe not in the first line trenches, but in the trench system someplace. They have a couple constant companions. Rats are a huge problem. You have lice and obviously nits. In areas where you have a high water table, you had to deal with that. And as you got closer to the coast, you had a higher water table in many cases. And you see some films oftentimes of these soldiers just constantly bailing out the trenches as they go. Well, what's the consequence of that? Trench foot. And what happens when you get to November and December and January? Then you have severe problems with that. And when the rains come, then this whole thing turns into a morass, and all these nice revetments start to be serious problems as well. And if you don't have sandbags or this kind of a lattice work holding up the sides of the trenches, then you've got even bigger problem. There was a pervasive smell in being in the trenches. How would you smell if you didn't get a chance to take a shower or a bath for a couple weeks on end, and the latrines were just a few feet behind, and you had to run and cover in that? And then you've got occasional gas, which we'll get into a little bit. And worst of all, once you got into a battlefield scenario and serious fighting, then you probably have decaying flesh. Maybe it's rats, maybe it's human flesh that you can't really get to. And that's the pervasive smell that you have to deal with. Still, the trenches were much better than being out in the open. What's the alternative? As far as they were concerned, there was no alternative. So they resorted to the trenches. And just a little bit here in terms of the description, this first picture is not a real good representation in one respect. A typical trench would be much deeper than this. It would probably be somewhere from 10 to 12 feet deep, and then you'd have to step up to the firing line and perhaps stand on that or perhaps kneel on that so you could fire out. After the trench system got stabilized, the last thing you typically want to do is to stick your head and expose your head out there, because the enemy would send people out into no man's land, snipers, and take pot shots at anybody they happen to see. So that's what a typical trench might look like, except it would be much deeper, and we'll see some more pictures that will illustrate that. Now, here is the trench system, because the initial assumption that we would all have is it's one continuous line of one trench. That was absolutely not the case at all. It would be a system of trenches. And because of artillery rounds possibly landing in the trench, you can see the nature of the design of these trenches that were actually dug. A zigzag pattern, a herringbone pattern, anything that would prevent a round landing in one part of the trench, taking out a huge line of people in that trench. By defensive, that you would absolutely have to do that. Now, to get a little bit closer look at this, a closer look, here you have the first line of trenches. Here you have a communications trench that connects these two, and this is the one that the soldiers would move back and forth, and probably somewhere along here would be located the latrines out of harm's way, perhaps. Oftentimes, the troops would be more concentrated in the second line of trenches and thinly populating the first line, just because they were assumption that would be more dangerous there. You also see a communications trench, a sap that's going out into no man's land, and this is most likely a listening post here. And it's subtle, but anybody guess what these three lines might be right here? That's your bands of barbed wire, correct. And that was another feature of the First World War. So on the left, that's the kind of defenses you would have at Petersburg. And for those of you who were participating in the Civil War presentations, you know by the time you get to 1865, it's trench warfare, because even the lethality of the weapons at that time. And how do you slow down the enemy? You have abatis or something like this, or a line of sticks in the ground trying to impede the advance. You didn't have to worry about that in World War I with the invention of barbed wire. Of course, an American invention. Why was it invented? For farm use, for ranching use. It was first used in warfare during the Spanish-American War. It was used in the Sino-Soviet War, between the Sino-Japanese War, Sino-Japanese War in the early 1900s. And during the Boer War, the British actually used it for concentration camps. So it had a multiple ways of being used, but it really found its use during the First World War as well. And here's the challenge. Let's say you are crossing no man's land, and then you encounter these kinds of obstacles, and you get hung up in the obstacles, and not too many yards away is that German machine gun firing away at you. So a huge problem, and what to do with the wire, how to get rid of the wire before you actually advance in the first place. Now, you've already heard me talk about artillery, but I wanted to get a sense of the kind of artillery that drove people into the trenches in the first place, and now different kind of artillery that's going to be employed because they are in the trenches. Difference between guns and the howitzers: a gun generally is a high velocity weapon, a flat trajectory. And oftentimes, when you think about a tank that has a gun on it, you can typically see the target you're shooting at. Howitzers is a little bit lower muzzle velocity, typically a higher trajectory. The advantage in trench warfare is you want to have it coming up. If you're going to attack the trenches, troops in the trenches, you want it coming straight down instead. So over time, you're going to see more and more heavier artillery being used. Here is the British 8-inch. Certainly the Germans had their equivalent of field howitzers of that scale. The Germans also, because they started the war with the assumption that they had to take out major fortifications in Belgium and France, had developed these huge siege weapons. Well, you can't put that behind a bunch of horses and drag it along. You have to maneuver it around with probably in a rail line in almost all cases. And that means it's not going to be moved quickly. But if you have a very stable front, this is the kind of weapon you want to be able to use more than anything else. The Germans start the war with a big advantage in the number of machine guns per unit, and especially in the number of heavy artillery that they had. Now you've got a weapon that can go after troops in trenches, go after bunkers. And both sides didn't just dig trenches, they dug bunkers. And again, especially the Germans, they dug a very elaborate system of bunkers that they would hide in during an enemy artillery barrage until the end of the barrage, and then they'd come out of the bunkers and man the trenches afterwards. So that's what you've got here. And counter battery fire. In other words, you'd rather take out the enemy's artillery before they blast you. And that takes a level of sophistication, knowing where the enemy artillery is. How do you possibly see where the rounds are landing in the first place if the enemy batteries are a mile behind the front line trenches? We'll get to that in just a minute. Here's another way to make life very miserable for soldiers during World War I, and that's gas warfare. Tear gas was the first used in 1914 on a limited scale on the Russian front. By 1915, the Germans had developed chlorine gas. It was a visibly greenish cloud moving across the battlefield. You could see it coming, which was something of an advantage, obviously, but it would be very intimidating. And when it was first employed, it terrified the Brits that was being used against at Ypres. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's wipers, I think is how the Brits actually pronounce it. It's a French word. Anyway, in Flanders area. And the Germans weren't really prepared to exploit the advantage they had from that first deployment. But then everybody starts using it afterwards. Chlorine is nasty stuff, but it's not quite as bad as phosgene, which was also developed and employed first in December of 1915. And it had a different smell than the chlorine gas did. And the disadvantage and advantage both at the same time. It really didn't take effect. If a soldier was contaminated with phosgene, it didn't take effect for about 24 hours. So they resist while the gas was first being employed. But once it kicked in, because of that, then actually most deaths due to gas during the First World War are due to phosgene. Now, the one we hear so much about is mustard gas, which is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, 1917, and that also is nasty, nasty stuff, because whatever part of your body is exposed to it, it's burned. So if you breathe it in, it burns your lungs. If you get it in your eyes, and think about it, how often do you sit there and rub your eyes about something, and especially in your kind of environment that they're in? It gets in your eyes. That's the kind of thing you're seeing right here. Nasty stuff, causing serious blistering. Mortars and grenades. As the fighting starts to get more sophisticated, they're adjusting their tactics. They're adjusting the kind of weapons that they use. And increasingly, mortars are handy things to have. You can move them farther forward. This one obviously has a fairly big punch, this German mortar. A lot of the mortars that were used were much smaller and therefore easier to go out into no man's land and carry. It's still a pretty heavy object to be hauling out there, especially when you're taking ammunition along with you. Other new weapons, grenades, trench knives, pistols, carbines, shotguns. Because quite frankly, those long rifles that we were showing to begin with, once you get in the trench, it's not real practical. Especially when you've got that long bayonet on top of it. You want a shorter carbine, you want to have a shotgun or something like that, and when you're mixing up in the trenches, some nasty looking trench knives that would develop as well. Just to give you a scale of how some of this is going to impact warfare, the Brits manufactured 75 million of these bombs. Mills bombs is what they were called. 75 million of them. And that's just one country. All the nations were doing the same kind of thing. Okay, now back to the problems of observation on the battlefield, the challenge that the artillery especially had if you're going to use it effectively. We always think about aircraft and we think about the glamour. If there is anything that's glamorous about the First World War, I suppose it's about air warfare, aerial combat between two fighter aircraft. That's not what the aerial warfare was really all about, especially initially. Hydrogen-filled balloons used for observation, used to adjust fire. You get high enough, you're far enough back, you're probably out of the range of the enemy, and you can see the battlefield. How do they communicate? They'd have a cable tethered from the balloon all the way to a truck on the ground, and then that would be relayed back to the firing batteries. Sometimes you'd have fixed-wing aircraft going out for observation as well. How did they get that message back? Well, signal flags, dropping notes down, a variety of different ways. Again, communication was a big problem during the war. So, once you have this kind of an object in the air, hydrogen-filled, think about the implications of that, obviously it becomes a major target. And that's where your fixed-wing aircraft come in, and that's going to evolve rather quickly as well. They would carry metal darts that they would drop on the enemy and trying to hit them in the trenches. They would drop hand grenades, and then they started to drop bombs and things like that as well. But they especially wanted to attack these observation aircraft, whatever they be, either balloons or other aircraft in the air. Because if you control the air and you control observation, that makes your artillery much, much more effective. And as we said before, that's the real killer of the war. And by the time you get to late 1916, now you see this aerial combat between two aces going after each other. But that's the transition that you're getting, and that's the reason that the air war is so important to begin with. Okay, now that I've set the stage, hopefully, to give you an idea of what the nature of trench warfare was all about, why they got bogged down in the trenches, what they were trying to do to break out of the trenches, it's now time to transition here and talk about Verdun and then the Somme. It's kind of an illustration of the way this actually worked. And both of these battles are in 1916. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February 21st to December 18th, 1916. 9 months. Now, obviously, the level of intensity varied from day to day, but 9 months that they were exposed to this kind of intense combat. And Verdun, if you're a Frenchman, especially a Frenchman of that period of time, was both a battle that you took intense pride about because the French ended up being victorious. I guess they could describe it that way. But also incredibly painful experience because of the level of casualties that they experienced. And this map here illustrates better than anything I know just how futile this combat was. You see the two shaded areas. In the south, this is where the Battle of Verdun occurred. It's going to be a German offensive in 1916. We'll get to the details here in a bit. But look how little terrain actually changed ground after 9 months of combat. And actually, the Germans gained that, and then they lost it again to the French in most cases. And for the Battle of the Somme, which isn't quite as long but even more deadly, you can see how little terrain actually changed hands in the Battle of the Somme. In the grand scheme of things, it was minuscule. You start to wonder then, if you're your average soldier, the futility of what you're doing. Erich von Falkenhayn, he takes over as the commander, the commander in charge of the German forces after Helmut von Moltke basically comes close to a nervous breakdown in September of 1914. Then Falkenhayn is going to take over. He's your typical Prussian career soldier. He was the Prussian chief of staff, not the German, the Prussian chief of staff at the beginning of the war. He is the descendant of Teutonic Knights. Doesn't he look every bit the soldier in this picture right here? He had a reputation of being stern and severe, somewhat visionary. He had a different vision than many of the other officers did. And why should this be any different from most places? He was somewhat of a favorite of the Kaiser's court as well, so it didn't hurt to be popular in political circles at the time. He thought that the war had to be won in the West, that you couldn't win it against Russia because such a vast amount of terrain that you had to conquer in Russia, that the whole German army could get swallowed up there. It had to be won in the West. And the target was probably the French. If you could figure out a way to take the French army out and then isolate the Brits, well, how do you do that? He did not necessarily believe that you could have a breakthrough. His experiences in the East, and especially seeing what had happened in the Western Front in 1915, led him to believe that that would be very, very difficult. What he decided then to do was to find a spot on the map that the French people and the French brass would have so much, what's the right word to use here, that they would value so much that they would never want to sacrifice it, that they would bleed themselves white defending that spot on the map rather than turn it over to the Germans. And what Falkenhayn found was Verdun, a old fortress city dating back into the early 19th century. It was one of the fortresses that the Germans had actually conquered in the Franco-Prussian War about a couple generations before. It was a point of intense pride for the French people as well. And so, on a very narrow front, what Falkenhayn plans to do is to mass his artillery, especially his field artillery, and then punch his way through with that field artillery and have the French army then bogged down in this fight at Verdun. Now, there's a lot of debate in terms of exactly what his intentions were, because he wrote about this afterwards in his memoirs, and he kind of wrote about it from the perspective of what had actually happened, trying to argue his case. But I think there is some merit to the things that most historians would believe in terms of having this massive fight of attrition, that maybe he didn't even want to seize Verdun city itself, that wasn't important, because if you seize the city, then the French would back away, and they wouldn't keep committing forces to that. The key was to have the French keep funneling their troops into this fight. So here is a quote from his memoirs after the war that Falkenhayn wrote.
If we succeed in opening the eyes of the French people to the fact that in a military sense they have nothing more to hope for, England's best sword would be knocked out of her hand. To achieve that object, the uncertain method of a mass breakthrough, in any case beyond our means, is unnecessary. We can probably do enough for our purposes with limited resources. Within our reach, behind the French sector of the Western Front, there are objectives for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death, as there can be no question of a voluntary withdrawal, whether we reach our goal or not.
So a little bit more specifics on this. As far as heavy artillery is concerned, the Germans are going to devote 542 heavy guns, large caliber guns, some of these as large as the Big Bertha we saw in the last picture. 306 field pieces on this very narrow front, so 1,300 guns altogether once they had everything lined up. They had some 420 millimeter mortars, the Big Berthas. They had 15-inch naval guns that they were bringing in on rail cars. And they had 305 millimeter mortars as well. They also established air superiority for the reasons I had just talked about. So they could dominate the skies and they could dominate the observation, make their artillery that much more effective. Stormtrooper tactics. They are starting to evolve different tactics and employing smaller level units, not company or battalion-sized forces moving across together, but smaller groups of squad or platoon level, anywhere from 10 to 40 people, moving across the battlefield, highly skilled, trained to maneuver, given more initiative than the average infantryman would be so they can respond to the situation they see, and especially go after the strong points that are identified. They had a new weapon as well. They had flamethrowers that they introduced in this battle. And there's another very terrifying weapon if you're on the receiving end to see that tongue of flame coming towards you also. They knew that the French would counterattack. And the hope then was that the French would bleed themselves so badly that they would eventually sue for peace and turn the war over to the Brits. And so now the Germans had to worry about the British Navy and their much smaller British Army as well. So, here's the opposite side, the French side of it. General Joseph Joffre served as the commander-in-chief of the French forces until later in 1916. He was the commander-in-chief during the early stages of the war. He led them through the first initial stage of total disaster for the French as they retreated beyond their borders. He led them to victory in the Battle of the Marne, the Miracle of the Marne. So he's somewhat of a hero to the French people. He's an artilleryman and engineer by training, but he, like most Frenchmen, is a strong disciple of the offensive. That was one of the tragedies of 1914 especially. They believed in the offensive so much that they sacrificed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers in trying to get a successful offense going. So he's the architect of that, but again, he's also the architect of the Battle of the Marne, known as Papa Joffre, kind of affectionately by the French people. General Henri Philippe Pétain, right here. A different kind of beast altogether. Joffre despised the man. Unlike most of the French officers, he never really got any serious service overseas in the empire. He spent most of the time in France itself. He was not a great fan of the offense. That's what put him at odds with the rest of the French staff and brass most of the time. So he wasn't favored by his superiors. But he is at the point that right at the early stages of this battle, he's going to be given command of the Second Army across from Verdun. He actually believes that cannon conquers and infantry occupies. Cannon conquers, infantry occupies. Well, that's heresy to a guy like Joffre and most of the French. In fact, most of trained officer corps across the European theater by that time. He takes command early in this campaign. He actually has double pneumonia when he first takes command, but he's also a brilliant logistician as well, and that's going to come in very handy in this one. And finally, the third person, Robert Nivelle, right down here. When Pétain is promoted after a couple months of the campaign, Nivelle actually takes command of the Second Army in April. Now, it says Verdun is a quiet sector. That's before the Germans launched their offensive on the 21st of February. In fact, it was so quiet that the French decided to move most of the big guns out of these fortifications. And what Verdun was, it was a series of established, elaborate fortifications with large bunkers, heavily staffed, kitchens, hospitals, the whole works. And much of that had been stripped away because it was a quiet sector. They needed this heavy artillery elsewhere. So it was only partially manned at the opening stages. Now, here's the map of Verdun, a little bit closer view than the one that you initially saw. The initial advance for the Germans is going to be on the west side of the Meuse River, so in this area right here. Douaumont, right here, is the main linchpin fortress that the French had, and you see plenty of other fortresses as you circle Verdun. Vaux is another one. You've got more along this route right down here, and then battery locations as well, scattered through here. So it's a series of these fortifications, interlocking fire, things like that. That was the key to the success, at least before the World War I actually began. On February 21st, in the morning, at dawn, German bombardment begins. Actually, it's at 4 a.m., sorry about that. In just a few hours, the Germans fire 1 million shells against the fortifications and trenches, primarily against the fortifications and the front-line trenches that you've got there. Saturation bombing, intense, meant to shock and destroy and to slaughter any Frenchmen who were in those trenches. At 4:45 p.m., approximately 12 hours later, the German infantry assaults and quickly gain territory as they move from this area towards these fortresses. By the time you get to the 25th is the date that Fort Douaumont actually falls, with practically no resistance. So it doesn't take long, just a few days, for the Germans to reach that point. And by this time, the French senior staff, the French people are panicking, because this is a disaster on massive scales. The French soldier, here's one comment I wanted to read of a French soldier about the time now the French are really going to respond to this in a serious way. I came up as a volunteer. I wanted to see Verdun and take part in the great battle. 150 of us left the bivouac. By the time we got up to the line, there were only 30 of us left, and we had not yet met the enemy. Oceans of mud, dark skies, like Golgotha at the hour that Christ died. No trenches up there, only holes, and holes blown into holes, all filled with the stink of the dead, a nightmare with no morning to come. So it gives you a painting, a word painting of exactly what it was like. And just think about it, just trying to get up to the front lines. The enemy artillery is decimating that particular unit before they even get there. And that is a very demoralizing experience, let me tell you. Pétain, over time, is going to rotate his troops frequently. About every 2 weeks, he wants to rotate a unit out and bring a fresh unit in. So eventually, practically every unit in the French army is going to be rotated through this battle that goes on month after month after month. April 30th, he is promoted to command the Army Group Center. That consists of 52 divisions. Think about it, 52 divisions. That's a massive force that he's got under control. Well over 500,000 soldiers. And Robert Nivelle, as I mentioned before, takes over the army. A few weeks later, on June 8th, Fort Vaux falls to the Germans. And so they keep moving on. And then July and October, once you get to early July, you have the Battle of the Somme. So now you are finally distracting the Germans' attention away from this vortex of violence that you've got in Verdun. But the battle keeps going on month after month after month. Here is the initial German advance. You can see the impact of the flamethrower that they've got. I certainly wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that. The Sacred Way. This is part of the legend of the Battle of Verdun. Some debate about when that particular phrase, the Sacred Way, actually was coined. Was it during the battle or afterwards? But it was the name for the absolutely crucial supply line. There were rail lines that were eventually being able to be constructed, but primarily it was this road that they were funneling troops and supplies back and forth. And we're talking about on a massive scale, way beyond what we had experienced in the Civil War. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops that had to be maintained in those frontline locations. And you can see some of the troops waiting to head up, some of the troops heading up, some supply lines coming in as well. The French poilu, that was the image of the French soldier at the time. He looks older, doesn't he? Got a nice beard on him. The reservist was a very important part of the French army by this time. You know, they had all had initial service in the army, and then they went into the reserves, and they were all called up in those early days of the war back in 1914. Poilu, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, stands for the hairy one. That was the name that they had for their soldiers. So you had doughboys, you got Tommies, you got the Huns, you got the hairy ones, is what the French were called. Here's what, after a while, August 16th, Falkenhayn himself is replaced because the war is not going well at that particular time. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff. These were the heroes of the Eastern Front. These were the heroes of the Battle of Tannenberg back in 1914, of the incredible successes the Germans had in the Russian front in 1915. Now they're going to replace Falkenhayn because his battle of attrition by that time is attriting the German army just as much as it seems to be attriting the French army. So he's out, Hindenburg and Ludendorff are in. And over the next couple years, you're going to see those two gentlemen grow more and more powerful with each and every month. Here's a good quote that gives you a sense of what it was like for the German soldier and the attitude they took towards it. There will be no end of this until the last Frenchman and the last German hobble out of their trenches on crutches to exterminate each other with pocket knives or fingernails. And why would they think anything else? The Germans were stuck there much longer periods of time than the French were, and you've got to feel a sense of resignation. You know, it's not a matter if you're going to survive, it's a matter of when you're going to be killed or injured. That had to be the attitude that they took. October 24th, because of Nivelle's offensives now, he has a much more offensive attitude than Pétain did. He takes Fort Douaumont back. It's recaptured. November 2nd, the French recaptured Fort Vaux. And by December 15th, the last major push there, 8 French divisions attack. The battle ends with something like 11,000 Germans surrendering. And it's getting into the winter. And finally, the Battle of Verdun comes to an end. So here's the cost. Here's what it looks like. Here's Fort Douaumont at the beginning of this campaign. Here it is after it's been seriously bombarded, probably sometime during the point in time when the Germans took over that particular fortification. And the Germans occupied in force after that. So you can barely recognize the terrain. But 40 million artillery rounds later, many of them centered at these fortresses that were so contested. Here's what it looks like. And you start to look at that and you try to figure out what it's like for an infantryman to try to run across that terrain. And you start to realize the serious challenges they had in trench warfare. Total involvement, something like 1,140,000 Frenchmen, anywhere from 75 to 85 divisions had cycled through this particular battle. Over 1.25 million Germans from 50 divisions. They tended to stay longer when they did. And now we get to the point of trying to figure out the casualties. And I found trying to determine casualty rates for the First World War even more challenging than and frustrating for me than for the Civil War. But here are the numbers for the Battle of Verdun. 162,000 killed or missing for the French, something like 143,000 for the Germans. So yes, the Germans seem to have done better if we can believe their numbers. Take a look at the wounded and then the totals. Slightly more French were casualties in this war than Germans. Here's the challenging part of this: missing. Why do you suppose these soldiers were missing? Well, I think we know why they were missing. Because when they go on these assaults and somehow they die in the middle of no man's land someplace, and you hear these accounts of they fall into a crater, and then an artillery round lands and buries them, and then an artillery round lands and uncovers them again, and then another artillery round lands and buries them again. Who's to know what happened to these people? And imagine the anguish then if you're the loved one back home and they don't know what happened. But you can guess. I mean, your imagination dreams up the worst for you. That's the horrors of Verdun, and that's why it had such a psychological impact on it. So having laid out what Verdun was like and having laid out what trench warfare in general is like, I want to kind of go through an anatomy of a battle, and then we'll turn our attention at the Somme itself. And this picture illustrates the kind of destruction that you get with that level of bombardment. So first you have the artillery preparatory fires in the early stages before the initial assault occurs, and its goal is to cut the enemy wire. Now you have to depend on your artillery to do a couple things. This is generally the smaller guns, the 75 millimeter guns, the British and the German equivalents of that. You have to have a good air burst. It's got an air burst at the right elevation. If it's too high, it scatters too much and it's not going to have the impact you want. If the round impacts, you got this nice explosion, but generally what happens is it kind of tosses the wire up and it's still there. So it has to be, you have to have good munitions and you have to have good officers and NCOs who can adjust that fire and make sure it's effective in the first place. And those are two huge ifs. Once you've got that, you generally also want to have the artillery hit the trenches to try to destroy the enemy in the trenches, to try to destroy the enemy in their bunkers, and hopefully they'll never even emerge in the first place. There will be empty trenches or filled with dead by the time you attack. The trench line oftentimes is gassed to push them out as well. And gas can work both ways. I don't think you want to be an infantry advancing into an area that has already been gassed unless you're absolutely prepared. So you have the infantry that then begins to advance, and let's say that, let's be optimistic, and the infantry occupies the enemy trenches. In the meantime, you've crossed this area. And look, they had to build this road after they crossed it. You can't bring any field artillery. Even a 75 couldn't cross that battlefield until you had some major improvement of the engineers going out there. Imagine being the guy who is the signalman or the wireman who's got a roll of wire that he's hauling across the battlefield to try to connect the frontline troops with the commanders back in the trenches or maybe a mile behind the trenches so you can inform the general officers what's going on. And what do you suppose happened to the wire that's laying on top of the ground? Of course it's cut. And that's why you hear lots of different variations, signal flags, carrier pigeons, but especially runners. One of the most dangerous jobs in the First World War, running back and forth, delivering the messages of what's been happening in the combat, because communication has absolutely broken down. And that's going to be a huge problem. So, especially in the case of the Germans, it was part of their tactics, standard procedure, that if you get attacked, then you stage a counterattack. And of course, it worked both ways, but the Germans were especially good at it. So you can anticipate, you attack, you seize the enemy trenches, and boy, you better be ready for that counterattack because you know it's coming. And if you've only gotten half of your force or a third of your force in those trenches in the first place, what's likely to happen? Your attackers are forced back. This is the pattern that they got to by the time you got to 1916. How do you break through? And it's not just one line of trenches. it's not just 2 line of trenches. In most cases, it's more than that. You might be able to break through 1 line of trenches. Then you still have the huge problem of what to do with the other 2 lines, or the other line. And that takes days to move all this equipment, the supplies up, the artillery up, to reestablish communications before you can launch the next step. And that's why, again, it gets all bogged down. So, let's turn to the Battle of the Somme. But before we do that, what we have to do here is take a look at Britain's new army. Because they start the war, unlike all the continental armies, they had a tiny, tiny regular army. They didn't need one. They had the ocean to protect them. They had the English Channel to protect them. And as we know, they dominated the oceans. The British Navy was the best in the world. The Germans tried to challenge them, but they were nowhere close. The British had 247,000. At the beginning of the war, the Germans and the French armies numbered in the millions. Much of their army was overseas. Only 129,000 was based in England. They did have a territorial force that was kind of like our reserves, based around different places in England. They were hardly up to the standards of the regulars at the time. And the problem with that force of 129,000, most of them got shipped to England in 1914. By the time you got done in 1915, most of those soldiers had been casualties, both the regular force and many of the territorials. Now you have the problem that really kicked off because Lord Kitchener, at the beginning of the war, envisioned, unlike almost everybody else, that this war wasn't going to be over by December, by Christmas time. He envisioned a long war. So by August of 1914, he starts calling for volunteers. And like so many of the young men in the First World War especially, they came in droves with great enthusiasm and signed up. They came at such levels that by 5 months, just by the end of the first year, 1914, 1 million Brits, Englishmen, had signed up and volunteered. 1 year later, by the end of 1915, they had 3 million. But who's left to train them? And how do you equip them? That becomes the real problem. And it doesn't take just a few months, especially if you have guys like me. I've been out of the Army for 15, 20 years. Now they call me up and send me out to do training for these people. And, I knew how it was in the old Boer War, but it doesn't work the same anymore. And I'm out there training them how to march and things like that. But that's only the rudimentary stuff. It's a real challenge. The British Army has to be raised very quickly because guess what France is doing? They're screaming that the Brits get in the war in a much more serious way. Otherwise, their attitude was, the Brits are fine and they can fight this war until the last drop of French blood. So training is one part of the problem. And you think it's hard for the average infantryman. Imagine how you train officers and NCOs. How do you train engineers? And how do you train all these artillerymen? I talked about how sophisticated that business had become. Well, maybe you have the staff to train them in the first place. What you don't have are rifles and uniforms and any other kind of equipment you can think of. You certainly don't have artillery that they can practice with. All of that stuff was grossly short. Now, one of the things that occurred in 1915, such a scale that they have a name for it, the shell scandal of 1915. Because the armies in Europe, the British Army in France, was crying out to be equipped with enough shells that they could fight effectively. And this got to be a major scandal, and it's one of the reasons that David Lloyd George emerged like he did. He became, let's see if I can find it here. Anyway, he took positions of Lord of the Ministry of Munitions, I believe, something like that. One of the other things that Lord Kitchener did early in the war, he appealed, you can see the classic brochure right here, Britain Needs You. He appealed to communities to raise their own battalions. And all of these soldiers that would join the same battalion then would be able to fight together in this glorious cause overseas. And you don't want to miss the romance of the war. This might be your only chance. And again, Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands joined up just on that appeal alone. And that's where you get all these PALS battalions, because all the PALs that joined up together to serve together. And again, if you think about what's going to happen later on, the trauma that's going to cause to these communities is horrendous. Now, as we go through the Battle of the Somme here, one of the things I want to do is focus on the Grimsby Chums. And I'll talk more about them a little bit later. But Grimsby is about 150 miles north of London. It's a fishing village, and it's going to factor into our story as we move along here. Grand strategy. December of 1915, there is a meeting between General French of the British Army, that's a confusion here, General John French of the British Army commands at that time, with Joffre, talking about what they want to see happen in 1916. And they want to have joint offensive. They want to have a combined offensive to put as much pressure on the Germans as possible. And oh, by the way, want the Russians to do the same thing, and the Ottomans, or excuse me, and the other parts of the empire to do the same thing, the Italians. So that was the initial meeting. Shortly after that, Douglas Haig takes command of the British forces. Douglas Haig is another old soldier, a cavalryman, a Scotsman, disciplined, a disciple of the defense or of the offense again. He's cold, headstrong. Again, he's socially well connected. It never hurts. And he is, if anything, he's tenacious. He's also a veteran of the Boer War and Indian Wars. Now, this is not going to be the same kind of war that he's going to encounter here. And after the war, this is kind of a curious note, he's a champion for World War I British veterans. In February 14th, Haig meets Joffre. Now, before it was French meeting Joffre. Now they're going to meet, and this is before, about a week before the German offensive at Verdun. They agree, there's some discussion, the Brits wanted to do it elsewhere, but they finally agreed to have an offensive, a joint offensive on the River Somme, with the Brits on the north side, the French on the south side, and the French would be in the lead. They would be the major push. Well, a couple weeks later, everything has changed because the French are fighting for the life in Verdun. So the spring meeting comes, and the warning that Joffre puts out is, if you don't do something now, the British or the French army will cease to exist. And now the British have to be in the lead. So Haig's plan by this time is on a fairly large, broad front, larger than the Germans had envisioned, a broad front of something like 25 kilometers. He's going to attack in phase one. And they're going to have enough artillery to suppress the Germans. And with the Brits now in the lead and the French in support. In phase two, they would seize the second line of defenses for the Germans, and possibly then afterwards, if all goes well, have a breakthrough. And just to make sure that you are ready for that, you have a cavalry corps waiting behind the lines. 3 whole divisions of cavalry waiting to exploit that breakthrough. So that's still in their minds. Henry Rawlinson here is the local commander of the 4th Army in that region. He has a little bit different vision of this. He doesn't see that the breakthrough is going to be as possible. He wants to concentrate the firing in a smaller area, and he wants to, his strategy essentially is bite and hold. You get a piece of land and you hold it, and then you start moving things forward again until you can take it over. Of course, eventually Haig's attitude is going to carry the day. Just a little bit about the terrain at the Somme. It is perfect for digging. It's a nice rolling terrain, chalky soil, and it's perfect for digging, and the Germans have done it in a major way. In fact, what they have now, this is kind of hard to see. This is 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, all the way up to 9,000 here. Here's their first line trenches. This is roughly where the British lines are. So these are very close, anywhere from a couple hundred yards to 800 or 900 yards distance from the British lines. That's the first line. And then back here you've got the second line. You've got all these communications trenches connecting all this stuff. That's probably pushing the limit or outside the limit of most of the British and French guns. So you can't even attack them in the first day. The third line, which the Germans are busily building in early 1916, is way behind, way out of range for the British guns. So that's what the Brits and the French are going to have to deal with in the early stages. The mood in the trenches was very ebullient. They were excited about this. They were looking forward to this in most cases. And I think to illustrate that, I want to get into, in the next slide here, talking about the Grimsby Chums and their example. So, July 1st at 7:30 a.m., the bombardment stops, the infantry attacks. 60,000 troops along a 13-mile front. If you look right here, you can get a good sense of the pack that he's got, the long rifle with the bayonet on top. That's the load that they're going to have to carry. And again, that's your standard infantryman. The wiremen are going to have that spool of wire they're going to be hauling across there as well. And lots of other equipment has to go forward. Some taking sandbags, some taking digging utensils, all kinds of equipment has to go over the top. Into no man's land. Creeping barrage, moving too fast in most cases. In most cases, in many cases at least, the enemy wire is uncut. In part, that's because something like a third of the British artillery are duds. Mostly a problem with the fuses. A lot of the artillery was manufactured in the United States. I'm not sure where the fuses were manufactured, but that's a huge problem for them. In fact, they're still digging up artillery rounds today, the French farmers are. In fact, I was able to walk across a field a few years back, and was very easy just to walk across and start picking up shrapnel that was still on top of the ground after it had been freshly plowed. What was the experience of the Chums? Well, here's their experience. 4:30, the Chums eat their breakfast along with the issue of rations. 5:30, they move forward to their jump-off positions. And at 6 o'clock, they're in the positions and they break into song. Gives you a sense of their attitudes at that moment. And includes little ditties like, I Love the Ladies. Maybe some of the songs that we heard as we came in here. 6:25, the artillery preparation intensifies. And at 7:28, approximately an hour later, a huge mine had been tunneled by the engineers underneath the German lines and packed with 24 tons of high explosives underneath the German lines. Think about the crater in the Battle of Petersburg, but only much bigger. That huge mine is detonated 2 minutes before they're supposed to attack. Huge explosion. See this mushroom cloud of dirt and clay being thrown into the air. The only problem is it was short of the German lines. And it was 100 yards wide. Now it becomes nothing but an obstacle for the troops as they move forward. 7:30, companies A, B, and C go over the top. In 4 lines, they advance. They go 10 yards, they drop. They raise up again, they move another 10 yards, they drop. But as they go far enough, some of the soldiers start to realize, well, they're dropping and they're not getting up. And they're not getting up because they've been hit. The great assumption that the Brits, all the way up the chain of command, had was an absolutely falsehood. The Germans were in their bunkers, they emerged from their bunkers, they manned their machine guns, and they were able to call in the artillery, and it became a killing field as far as a lot of the British troops were. Yet, just like clockwork, 9 o'clock, D Company goes in advance, just like they had planned in the first place, experienced the same thing. Only a very small number of Chums actually made it to the German trenches, and eventually they're going to be repulsed. Most of the rest, they lay injured in no man's land, or they managed to make their way back to the friendly lines. And in many cases, they didn't make their way back to friendly lines until darkness had occurred. So that was the experience for the Chums and much of the rest of the British Army. So let's get a flavor again of some other quotes that here. This one, a German.
When the English started advancing, we were very worried. They looked as though they must overrun our trenches. We were surprised to see them walking. We had never seen that before. I could see them everywhere. There were hundreds. The officers were in front. I noticed one of them walking calmly, carrying a walking stick. When we started firing, we just had to load and reload. They went down in their hundreds. You didn't have to aim. We just fired into them. If only they had run, they would have overwhelmed us.
And from the British perspective,
the trench was a horrible sight. The dead were stretched out on one side, one on top of each other, 6 feet high. I thought at the time I should never get the peculiar, disgusting smell of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. I would rather have smelt gas 100 times. I can never describe that faint, sickening, horrible smell which several times nearly knocked me up altogether.
So, July 1st, that's the day of this. Most Brits would, if you were to ask them what the saddest, the most forlorn day in their history of that long country, that ancient country, they would say it's July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The Third Army results in the northern portion basically ended up in failure, but the casualties were rather low. But you get here from this region right here all the way down to the road here between Albert and Bapaume, this is where the casualties for the 4th British Army were horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Below the road, this region right here, the 13th Corps attack was much more successful. And when you get down to the French sector, who had a lot more heavy artillery and a little bit more sophisticated infantry tactics, they did much, much better. So the decision is made by Haig and others. Let's reinforce success. Let's move our future attacks through here. But the decision has to be made. Do we continue the attacks? Just like in the Battle of Verdun, they didn't really feel it. I don't think they felt like they had too many choices. They were getting a lot of pressure from politicians in London, and especially a lot of pressure from their French allies to continue the attack, to take the pressure off the Verdun. And so they decided to attack. Now, casualties for the 4th British Army, 19,240 killed in one day. And you add in the rest of the Brits, you got close to 20,000. 57,400 total casualties of about 100,000 that were initially employed. That's a huge percentage. The French casualties, something like 1,590. The Germans, the numbers vary widely in the German case, but maybe 10 to 12,000 casualties. One particular battalion suffered 684 casualties, 91%. The Chums lost right at 60%. 15 officers dead or missing or wounded. 487 men altogether. So horrendous casualties. But one of the problems, and again, this is a communications breakdown, what do the generals think the casualties are at the end of day one? 16,000 dead, maybe. And the expectations were this is going to be bloody, we're going to lose a lot of people, but 16,000 is what they thought. It would take days before they'd be able to sort all this out. So yes, they would continue the assault. And one more quote here from a private from the 4th.
On the far side of no man's land, I found the German wire cut, but only 3 of our company got past there. There was my lieutenant, a sergeant, and myself. The rest seemed to have been hit in no man's land. The officer said, God, where's the rest of the boys?
I think that pretty much says it all. So, how long does the Somme last? From July 1st all the way up to November 18th. Months and months of combat. And I don't want to spend too much time going through this. We pretty much painted the picture I wanted to achieve. One thing that's significant of this 141-day campaign is September 15th is the first use of tanks during World War I. It's an experiment. The Brits started rather early on this. In the fall of 1914, Churchill was one of the early champions of this. Even though he was Lord of the Admiralty, he kind of took that under his arm. 49 tanks were available on the 15th. Only 18 of them got into no man's land in the first place. All the rest of them broke down on the way to the battlefield. And it didn't take long for the rest of them to be rather easy targets because they moved at 1/2 mile per hour. So, but that's shock. And again, the Brits weren't ready to exploit it even if they had been more successful. So the lessons of the first, July 1st, was you needed much better coordination with the artillery. You needed much better observation capability. You had to solve the communications problem. That was a conundrum that they never really got a good handle on. And then you had to deal with the psychological impact of this. And as I mentioned, it was the darkest day of England's long, long history. Basil Liddell Hart called it a tragedy of heirs. A.J.P. Taylor, these are both major military historians after the war. He called it the day that idealism perished on the Somme. And here's another interesting footnote. One of the casualties on the German side was a young man, 27-year-old corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler. He was a casualty at the Somme. Now, I hesitate to even put these casualty figures up because when I started to do the research, the casualty numbers were just all over the map. But I wanted to give some sense of the scale of the loss and the impact that this is going to have on European society for generations afterwards. Just on the Somme itself, for that 5-month campaign, 415,000 Brits, 202,000 French. The numbers for the Germans, anywhere from 430 to 650,000. Who knows? So well in excess of 1 million casualties for the Battle of the Somme. And I started thinking about why the numbers were all over the map. Well, did they include prisoners of war? Did they include missing? We talked about the missing that were in these battles. Did it include a person being injured in July, coming back to the battle, being injured again later on, or being killed later on? How do you count this stuff up? So I offer those cautionary tales for these numbers. But the fact is that it was a traumatic experience for Britain, for France, and for Germany. And it was a battle of attrition, a war of attrition now. Which army was going to break first? And that's a conversation for future presentations, I think. Now, you see the cemetery at Thiepval. I've actually visited that cemetery. What's in that cemetery? 72,246 missing British Empire servicemen who died somewhere between 1916 and 1918 on the battlefield of the Somme. That's 72,000 people who couldn't be identified, just found on the battlefield. I'd like to encourage you to get a real sense of it in a different kind of a format with what I consider the classic film of the First World War. And even though it came out in 1930, it stands up incredibly well. All Quiet on the Western Front, that shows July 26th, right here in this theater again. Very brief introduction, and then we'll have a chance to see a movie that was so powerful that the Nazis banned it from theaters. Because like every First World War movie, it's an anti-war movie. How could it be anything else? Thank you very much for coming here tonight. And give credit to our narrators as well.